While I was researching a video on the Hawker Seahawk, I came across an unusual story from the Indian Navy about a pilot who survived a ditching by ejecting while his aircraft was underwater. It had never occurred to me that such a thing was possible, but it did make sense that in such a desperate circumstance a pilot might have no choice but to resort to the seat, because water pressure would make it virtually impossible to open a canopy outwards away from an aircraft. This was why most early Navy jets had sliding canopies, which were generally left open on takeoff and landing. But as aircraft got heavier and faster and catapults got more powerful, having an open cockpit became impossible because the aircraft accelerated too fast to get the canopy closed in time. Ejector seats did eventually become operable at zero altitude and low airspeed to compensate, but there was a 10 to 15 year delay. And, as you're about to see, strange things happen at sea. Ejection underwater is a very risky move. The same forces that prevent a pilot pushing the canopy open also prevent the explosive charges that usually jettison it from working as well. So the pilot has to go out through the plexiglass and into the icy sea carrying a bunch of stuff that could be very useful above the water, but would be potentially lethal underneath it. For this reason, only 4 men have survived the attempt. The Westland Wyvern was a beast of an aircraft, dwarfing its companions on the decks of the Royal Navy's carriers in the middle 1950s. It's rightly world famous as the first turboprop strike fighter and the last fixed-wing product from Westland before they turned to the dark side of aviation. It was also the platform for the first underwater ejection. It happened on a normal Wednesday on board HMS Albion. 813 Naval Air Squadron had recently embarked for the Wyvern's debut appearance at sea. On deck, Lieutenant Bruce McFarlane lined up his aircraft for takeoff. Moments later, the flight deck officer gave the signal for launch. Steam filled the catapult piston and accelerated the aircraft to 70 knots in the space of 150 feet. At this point, a design flaw that had somehow escaped discovery during the Wyvern's 8 years of development revealed itself. A pump located on the centerline drew fuel from both wing tanks and then drove it forward 6 feet to the 3,500 horsepower Armstrong Siddeley Python turboprop. Unfortunately, the acceleration from the catapult caused the fuel in the supply pipe to move backwards, starving the engine, at which point it flamed out. Lieutenant McFarlane disconcertingly found himself just above stall speed in an aircraft whose engine was running down and with 24,000 tons of carrier just over his shoulder. Shockingly, the Wyvern made a poor glider. It did, however, make a passable impression of a brick, and it started to sink rapidly after it entered the water right in the path of the carrier. Its descent into the depths was not sufficiently fast to prevent it being hit by Albion's bows, which sliced the Wyvern in half aft of the cockpit. Trapped inside and without an air supply, Lieutenant McFarlane fell back on his training, despite it not specifically covering being in an underwater death trap. The Wyvern was now about 20 feet down with the nose at a 30-degree down angle. First, he found and hit the large yellow emergency canopy jettison button with his right hand. Although the canopy unsealed and green water began to flow in, it didn't fully detach due to the water pressure. Then, as the hull of the carrier thundered overhead, he immediately pulled the ejector seat handle with his left hand, at which point nothing happened. Remembering a similar situation occurring on the ground training rig, he desperately made a second, stronger pull on the handle. This triggered the first explosive charge. The expanding gases started the seat's movement before a second, stronger charge propelled him clear of the aircraft. He immediately blacked out. When he came to, he found himself tumbling in the maelstrom of water under the Albion's hull. As if that wasn't enough, he soon realised he was being dragged deeper under the water. Somehow he had to free himself from the tangle of webbing that was his parachute. At this point he remembered his Mae West. Pulling the toggle that inflated the life jacket, he popped up to the surface like a cork into the sunshine about 200 yards astern and to port of the carrier. The plane guard helicopter was already waiting for him, and within minutes he was back on the deck, nursing a broken collarbone. McFarlane was only the 53rd member of the Martin Baker Club, and the first to use one of its seats underwater, a situation that at the time hadn't really been considered by the company in its design. With the somewhat fortunate demonstration that ejector seats could work underwater, the Admiralty began a program of research to inform future designs. The Sea Vixen and Buccaneer were equipped with an underwater escape system that offered an alternative to the potentially lethal activation of a rocket motor in an enclosed space. It also automatically dealt with the issue of parachute and seat separation and life jacket inflation, even in the event of the pilot being incapacitated. A tiny static pressure hole was drilled in the port side of the cockpit. A hose led from the hole to the pressure-sensing diaphragm assembly of a compressed air firing unit at the base of each ejection seat gun. There are, however, no reports of any crew surviving or indeed attempting to execute an underwater ejection using this system in a genuine emergency. There were successful tests using a static Sea Venom fuselage in a water tank with a human pilot. In Buccaneer testing, dead sheep were apparently used as the test subjects. McFarlane was a Kiwi who was born in Auckland in August 1923, but he had flown for the Royal Navy after training in the US in 1943. He died at Birdham in West Sussex in February 1992. It was nearly 15 years before the next entry into the exclusive club that he started. Those of you who've looked into this topic in the past might well have expected me to immediately talk about a Corsair and USS Constellation. I'm definitely getting there, but another much less well-known incident occurred 2 years prior, on the 19th of September 1967. A German starfighter flight was on exchange to Tanagra in Greece. One of these aircraft, flown by Hauptmann Joseph Hoffmann, was on a training mission when it suffered a serious oil leak, resulting in an open nozzle failure. This was depressingly common on the F-104's J-79 engine, and it left the aircraft with a functioning turbine but no thrust. Since there was no manual override for the nozzle, Hoffmann had no choice but to make an emergency landing at Kirkira Air Base on Corfu. He lined up, but overshot the runway and ended up in the sea. The starfighter immediately began to sink until the cockpit was about 3 meters under the water and with the canopy sill barely out of the mud on the seabed. As a Luftwaffe pilot and thus unfamiliar with underwater escape, Hauptmann Hoffmann unstrapped from his seat, pulled the toggles to activate his life vest and tried to jettison the canopy. But the water pressure prevented the canopy lifting more than a few centimeters, just enough to cause water to start leaking in. Since he was in total darkness, Hoffmann could only hear this sign of impending doom. Now in even more serious trouble, he strapped back into his seat again, pulled the handles above his head, and ejected. He smashed through the canopy out into the water, coming to floating on the surface but in agony. When he was rescued, it transpired that his back was broken, but at least he did survive the experience, which was pretty lucky as the Lockheed C-2 seat in the Starfighter wasn't rated for use below 120 knots, and the aircraft certainly had no provision for underwater ejection. The extent of Joseph Hoffmann's injuries was such that he was unable to return to flying duties. He also had the ignominy of being referred to as Corfu Hoffmann thereafter. His aircraft was recovered, used as an instructional airframe for a period, and then it was disassembled, its tail being used to repair another aircraft that had been damaged in 1969. Russ Pearson was in the final stages of carrier qualification as he guided his A-7 Corsair II towards USS Constellation's stern for the first of 6 scheduled night landings. More than 2 years of training at 5 different bases had led up to this point. If he was successful, then his next stop would be the Gulf of Tonkin and combat over Vietnam. He'd been awake since 0330 and made 7 successful traps already. Fatigue was beginning to set in. Call the ball, came the instruction from Connie's final approach controller. For this mission, he was flying an A-7B, Bureau number 154392, belonging to VA-122, who were responsible for training of West Coast squadrons on the type. This was the end of their time with the B model, as VA-122 was about to receive A-7Es in July 1969. A light drizzle was falling from a low overcast above the landing pattern, but the sea state was calm. Pearson called it, positioning the A7 on the glide slope. He had £4,000 of fuel remaining, which was plenty for a couple of go-arounds if he needed them. Everything looked good. The final half-mile to the ship was over in a matter of seconds. The Corsair passed through the turbulent air over the fantail and smashed its £25,000 down onto the steel deck. The straps dug into Pearson's shoulder as the plane abruptly decelerated from 135 knots to nearly zero in less than 3 seconds. Piece of cake, he thought. 5 more, and he'd be qualified. But everything wasn't quite as good as it seemed. The landing had been at the right speed and on the glide slope. The tailhook had engaged the ideal number 3 wire. All was not well, however, as the plane was drifting fast towards the port catwalk. Tired from the long, hard day, Pearson had made a small but critical mistake. So focused was he on flying the ball that the landing centerline had momentarily dropped out of his scan. A late line-up correction had set up a right-to-left rollout as the plane decelerated down the angled deck. The A7 skirted the port deck edge before stopping feet away from the catwalk. The port main landing gear dropped off the deck edge. Unfortunately for all concerned, the protective steel scupper plate guarding the deck edge had been removed during Constellation's recent trip to the shipyard, and it hadn't been replaced. It's amazing how fast things can go from fine to disaster in less than a heartbeat. The Corsair was perched precariously on the edge of the flight deck with the fuselage tilting at least 60 degrees down. Ejection now would be suicidal because the trajectory of the ejection seat's rocket motor would send the seat skipping across the water like a flat rock on a farm pond. If the hook could remain engaged with the arresting gear cable, then the situation might still be salvageable though. The hook, after all, was designed to stop all of that mass moving at 150 knots, so it was more than strong enough. Remarkably, Lieutenant Pearson remained calm and clear despite the surprising and terrifying course of events. He pulled the throttle aft and around the horn to shut down the engine. The engine was no use now anyway, and if the hook did break, then the combination of a hot turbine and cold seawater was likely to be terminally explosive. As the TF-30 spooled down below 65% RPM, the generator dropped off the line and cut off all electrical power. The radio and interior lights went out, leaving the cockpit in total darkness. All contact with the world outside was lost. Moments later, the aircraft lurched forward. The strange angle at which the aircraft was hanging had caused the tailhook to disconnect from the arresting cable. The plane tumbled off the flight deck and plunged downwards some 60 feet prior to impacting the Pacific. In the dark, soundless cockpit, the sensation was like falling into a black hole. Lieutenant Pearson had learned in survival training that a ditched aircraft normally sinks at about 10 feet per second, and after 100 feet, crew survival is highly unlikely. That gave him 10 seconds to get out alive. He was sitting in his only chance at salvation. No US aviator had ever attempted an underwater ejection, or if they had, they hadn't survived it. Pearson would have to be an aviation buff of the highest order to have heard about Lieutenant McFarlane's escape 15 years prior. So the chances of escape were already remote, and there was also the chance he might eject directly into Connie's passing steel hull, or even worse, into one of her massive propellers. For this reason, he delayed his attempt at history for a few seconds to let the ship pass. Then he reached for the handle. The A7 was fitted with an Escape Pack IG-2 ejection seat. Made by Douglas for the Navy, it was fitted with 2 handles. The primary was above the pilot's head and placed his body in the right position to endure the G-forces exerted by the rocket motor. The alternate was between his legs, and it was this one that the Navy trained pilots to reach for in an emergency on account of its proximity, more obvious location, and the basic fact that it is easier to move your hands down rather than up, especially when pulling G. Pearson grabbed the ejection handle, closed his eyes, and, expecting the worst, pulled straight up. And nothing happened. Time seemed to stand still. He was at this point running on adrenaline, pure survival instinct. The delay was only a millisecond, but it seemed more like a minute. The rocket motor suddenly fired with a sudden blast of bright light, following its built-in sequencing delay. In an instant, he was out of the cockpit and clear of the seat, though still some tens of feet down in the cold, dark water of the Pacific. But his ordeal was by no means over. The rushing water had forced the oxygen mask down around his chin, and the emergency oxygen bottle in the seat pan was useless. Worse still, he had no idea what was up or down, and thus where the surface might be found. Just then, a cluster of lights flickering on the surface caught his eye. Recognising the immediacy of his plight and the fact that the carrier wasn't going to stop in a hurry, the flight deck directors had tossed their watertight flashlight wands over the side to mark the location for the plane guard destroyer and the search and rescue helicopter. The lights also served to orient Lieutenant Pearson. Within seconds he was on the surface, gulping down air. Those lungfuls were accompanied by searing pain from his back and a terrifying tug from below. The altitude sensing device that automatically deployed the parachute had activated and the chute had partly opened. The canopy and its nylon shroud lines were streaming behind the young lieutenant, overpowering his frantic efforts to keep his head above water. He grabbed for the nylon toggles that inflated the lobes on the Mark III-C survival vest, but they weren't where they should have been. The vest had been twisted round by the force of the ejection seat pushing him up through the water. As his strength sapped away, the parachute was beginning to win its battle to drag him under. And now he felt a shape bump him below the surface. During the ejection through the plexiglass canopy, his left forearm had been sliced and was bleeding profusely. His blood ran cold as he imagined surviving the last few moments only to be eaten by a giant fish. There were repellent sachets in his survival vest, but he was too caught up fighting the parachute to reach for them. The object brushed him again, long enough for Pearson to realise that it was the plane. It had impacted the water with minimal force and was virtually intact. With its wing fuel bladders and over half the fuselage fuel cells filled only with air, Corsair 202 was floating upside down just beneath the surface, still bobbing from Connie's passing wake. He had surfaced alongside the aircraft and his legs had brushed against its tail. Hanging on to the horizontal stabilator for support, he finally located the life vest's inflation toggles, which had wrenched around to his side during the ejection. Grasping a lanyard with each hand, he pulled down and away, and whoosh, the flotation lobes inflated instantly. He'd brought a moment's respite, and now his training kicked in. He rolled over on his back and reached upward along the parachute risers until he located the cock fittings, the small metal latches that connect the harness to the parachute. He lifted up on the cover and pulled down on the latch. In an instant, the chute was gone. As a reward for his efforts, he was illuminated by a blinding light from above. Constellation SAR helicopter was hovering noisily overhead. The onrushing plane guard destroyer turned away to let the helo crew do their job. Moments later, a rescue swim from the helicopter was in the water next to him, and before he knew it, he was sprawled on the aluminium floor in excruciating pain. In sickbay aboard the carrier, it transpired that he had escaped but with severe injuries. The alternate ejection handle might have expedited his exit from the cockpit, but reaching down between his knees to grasp the secondary handle in an inverted submerged cockpit had placed the lieutenant's upper body in a vulnerable, dangerously curved position. The brutal G-force of the seat firing had broken his back. Amazingly, this wasn't Lieutenant Junior Grade Pearson's last close escape that week. 3 days later, he was due to be medevaced to shore, but was bumped off the flight by a critical injury suffered by one of the deck crew. That helicopter suffered a catastrophic failure and went down in the ocean, killing all 6 people aboard. There are a couple of points worth noting about this story. Although Pearson's very detailed account says that the accident happened shortly before midnight on the 10th of June, the official accident report says that it happened on the 9th. I've gone with Pearson's version. More interesting in my mind are points about training and underwater ejection. Whether as a result of the British experience or basic logic about the potential for such incidents, the US Navy had taken steps to enable use of ejection seats underwater and to train their pilots. The video uses a Corsair 2 as the aircraft model. It explains that ejections are possible from any aircraft attitude with no preparation as long as the aircraft is in at least 10 feet of water. Surface ejection should never be attempted as the seat wasn't 0-0 and therefore the parachute wouldn't open in time, dumping the pilot into the sea from 80 feet up. As then Lieutenant Pearson experienced, in an underwater ejection the seat goes out through the canopy. To prevent spinal injury, the guide recommends gripping the face curtain tight against the head as soon as the cord is pulled. The pilot was then to pull the emergency release handle to ditch the seat and then separate, which requires kicking and swimming violently. In the event that the chute got caught, then the pilot was told to release the riser fastenings and then swim clear. Only when clear should he inflate his life vest and then ascend to the surface. In fairness to the video, it makes reference to this being quite difficult and requiring significant pilot effort, which is what Pearson experienced. Russ Pearson retired in 1992 as a commander. By that point, a fourth member had joined the club. INS Vikrant, India's sole carrier, was exercising its Seahawks, Elises, Sea Kings and Cheetahs. On deck was the Hawker Seahawk of Commander Peter Debras. The Seahawk taxied up to the catapult and was centred and loaded by the flight deck crew. In normal operation, an aircraft using the steam catapult is restrained by a holdback unit, which retains the aircraft even at full power until the catapult fires. Moments before launch, the holdback breaks with the engine at full power, and the steam pressure propelling the bridle forward along the launch rail tows the aircraft with it. At the end of the stroke, the bridle falls off and the aircraft climbs away. This wasn't a normal day. Even before the catapult could be fired on signal from the flight deck officer, the holdback unit gave way prematurely, and a malfunction fired the catapult without full pressure having been built up. The aircraft started moving under its own power and covered the 125-foot catapult length in moments, but with nothing like enough speed for flight. It therefore rolled off the deck and into the sea, right in front of the oncoming carrier. The plane guard was a Cheetah helicopter, call sign Jumbo. It headed for the location as the carrier thundered past and began to turn. The Seahawk sank. In its cockpit, Peter Debras shared the presence of mind of Bruce McFarlane and Russ Pearson. He felt the thunderous vibration of 19,500 tons of carrier passing overhead. After what must have seemed like an age, he sensed the noise of the churning propellers fading away. Then he said a prayer, reached up and pulled the cords. Moments later, he was floating on the surface in his orange life vest. The Cheetah swooped in, and Peter Debras was saved. He received his gold tie pin from Martin Baker. Years later, he would retire as an admiral and live out the rest of his days in Goa. Inevitably, there are rumours of other underwater ejections. Some are simple to analyse, others are more tantalising. There was a story in the book Fly Navy, The View from the Cockpit, suggesting that well-known Fleet Air Arm Commander Mike Crossley had his own Wyvern underwater ejection. But that didn't happen. It was a retelling of the McFarlane story attributed to Crossley, who was, I believe, commanding 813 Squadron at the time. In the Mediterranean in 1956, Lynn Middleton ejected from 2 Seahawks in quick succession. The second of these is sometimes suggested to have been underwater. Middleton's own account of the incident refutes this idea, although one can see where the rumour came from. His aircraft caught fire on the catapult due to a faulty fuel cap dumping gallons of fuel over the jet pipe. Because the catapult sequence had already been initiated, he was launched out over the bows with the engine at full RPM. He therefore achieved flying speed, but was on fire like a comet. Middleton had already decided to eject. He had, however, left the canopy slid open for takeoff. Ejecting with it in that position would shoot him straight into the metal strip that formed the front edge of the canopy. He was unable to jettison the canopy so that he could start the ejection sequence, and therefore he couldn't eject, which was probably for the best as the Seahawk's seat only functioned safely at 120 knots of speed and 500 feet of height. The aircraft stalled, dropping a wing and crashing into the sea. Middleton had significant trouble getting out because he had dislocated his shoulder. Various items of equipment snagged him as he tried to escape, and then he had to fight himself free with one hand. He cleared the aircraft, pulled his Mae West, but it didn't inflate, so Middleton had to swim up under his own power towards the light above him. The next thing he knew, he was in the sick bay, but with no recollection of how he got there. Seemingly, as he got closer to the surface, the life vest was able to inflate, and it shot him up to the surface, where the helicopter crew were able to rescue him. So Lynn Middleton had a remarkable escape from deep underwater, but not by means of the ejection seat. There is a legend of an underwater ejection from a sea venom off the Isle of Wight, in which the crew apparently didn't realise they were inverted and died as a result. There are no records of this occurrence in official crash accounts, although there was an incident where a Sea Vixen struck the deck during a failed wave-off, It went into the sea where the pilot was rescued by a diver, but the observer perished. Neither had attempted to use their seats. There is, however, one last tale. In the fall of 1973, a Royal Australian Navy Skyhawk pilot named Barry Evans deployed as a member of 805 Squadron to the RNAS Melbourne. On the 8th of November, the carrier was conducting operations during its passage to Singapore. As you can see in this video, he was the victim of a cold shot that left the Skyhawk at 90 knots rather than the necessary 120. The aircraft immediately plummeted off the bows right into the carrier's path. Evans had by that point already grabbed the ejection handles and pulled hard, but the striker plate in the system was frozen solid and the seat failed to fire. Subsequent investigation would reveal that 4 of the remaining 7 Skyhawks aboard also had the same problem. Fortunately, activating the ejection sequence blasted the canopy off. Not that Barry Evans was likely feeling very lucky in that millisecond. The Skyhawk hit the water at a near vertical angle. Melbourne was making 22 knots and it smashed into the little Skyhawk, tumbling it as it passed underneath the hull. Water immediately started to flood in. Evans regained his composure and found the manual harness release. His first attempt to escape was prevented by some other obstruction and he had to go back to free himself, just as he heard Melbourne's churning screws overhead. He surfaced only 100 or so yards behind the carrier and was shortly thereafter plucked out of the water uninjured by Pedro, the plane guard Wessex helicopter. There were apparently those that considered Lieutenant Evans to be lucky not to have ejected as he went over the bows, as the Skyhawk's ejection seat wasn't rated for operation at such low altitude and speed. And indeed, it was the deployment of 0-0 ejection seats from the late 1960s onwards, coupled with a drastic reduction in the number of Navy's operating aircraft carriers, that essentially made underwater ejection a thing of the past by the 1980s. Better to punch out early and swing down under silk. But who knows, maybe there's an edge of the distribution event out there in the future that'll induct the 5th member of the Underwater Ejection Survivors Club.
Brakes! Stop, 513. Eject. There they go.